The first thing I learned about the planet was that even the air seemed nervous. It moved in thin, cautious currents, as if it had somewhere to be, but wasn't entirely sure it was allowed to go there. I noticed that before I even stepped off the transport, which should have been my first warning that I had made a mistake. Not a small mistake, like mislabeling a storage crate or forgetting a tool in orbit, but the kind of mistake that quietly rearranges the rest of your life. My name is irrelevant to most of the people here, which is comforting because I prefer not being remembered on a planet where memory itself feels like a liability. I was assigned as a systems technician, which sounds impressive until you realize it mostly involves fixing things that other people broke while trying to look important. I expected broken consoles, maybe a few unstable power cores, perhaps an overly dramatic commander who would shout at me while I worked. What I did not expect was her. They didn't say her name during the briefing. They didn't have to. The moment her image appeared on the screen, the entire room shifted. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A few people straightened their posture like they had been caught doing something illegal, and one man near the back coughed in a way that sounded suspiciously like fear. She stood there in the projection, silent, her long ears slightly angled back, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the camera, as if she was already listening to something none of us could hear. Primary asset, the officer had said, in a tone that suggested the word asset was doing a lot of emotional heavy lifting. I remember raising my hand, which in hindsight was my second mistake. Asset for what exactly? I asked, because I enjoy clarity, especially when my continued existence might depend on it. The officer looked at me the way people look at someone who has just asked why gravity works. For everything, he replied. That was not helpful. By the time I actually saw her in person, I had convinced myself that the stories were exaggerated. They always are. People love turning dangerous individuals into myths because it makes their own fear feel more meaningful. I told myself she was just another soldier with a reputation that had grown out of proportion. Maybe she was fast, maybe she was strong, maybe she had a tendency to glare at people until they reconsidered their life choices. Nothing I couldn't handle. Then I turned the corner in the main corridor and almost walked directly into her. I stopped so abruptly that my boots made a sharp sound against the metal floor, echoing far louder than it should have. She didn't move. She didn't even blink. Her presence filled the corridor in a way that made the walls feel unnecessary, like they existed only out of habit. Up close, she looked almost human, but not quite. Her features were too precise, her posture too controlled, and those long ears, subtle, elegant, unmistakable, tilted ever so slightly as if adjusting to my existence. I became aware of my own breathing, which felt suddenly uncoordinated, like I had forgotten how it worked. I considered saying something intelligent, something calm and professional, but what came out instead was, I was definitely going this way first. She stared at me. It was not an aggressive stare. It was worse. It was the kind of focused attention that suggests she was evaluating whether I was a threat, a nuisance, or a temporary inconvenience that would resolve itself if ignored long enough. I smiled because smiling is what humans do when they have no better ideas. No rush, I added, gesturing vaguely to the corridor behind me. You can go ahead. I can stand here. For a while, possibly forever. Still nothing. Her eyes didn't leave me, and I had the unsettling impression that she was not just looking at me, but through me, as if she could see the tiny electrical signals in my brain desperately trying to assemble a coherent thought. Then very slowly, she stepped past me. The movement was silent, controlled, efficient. The air shifted again, that same cautious motion I had noticed earlier, like it was making room for her. I remained exactly where I was for several seconds after she passed, because moving felt like it might trigger something. When I finally turned, she was already at the far end of the corridor, her figure receding but somehow still dominating the space. A group of soldiers stood off to the side, watching her with a mixture of respect and something very close to panic. One of them looked at me. "You spoke to her," he said, as if I had just announced my intention to step into an active reactor core. "I wouldn't call it speaking," I replied. "It was more of a survival-oriented noise." He didn't laugh. That was when I realized something important. On this planet, humor was not a shared language. Fear was, and she, apparently, was fluent in it. I adjusted the toolkit slung over my shoulder and exhaled slowly. Well, I muttered to myself, this is going to be an interesting assignment. Somewhere in the distance, a faint metallic sound echoed through the structure, sharp and precise. Without thinking, I flinched. And then I noticed something else. At the very end of the corridor, far beyond where she had disappeared, she had stopped. Just for a moment, her head tilted slightly, one ear shifting as if catching something subtle, something distant, or perhaps something close. Then she continued walking, and the corridor felt empty again. I stood there staring after her, with the uncomfortable realization that whatever I had just stepped into, it was already paying attention to me. By the time I reached my assigned quarters, I had already decided two things. First, whoever approved my transfer here either hated me personally or had a very creative sense of humor. Second, I was going to keep talking, even if no one answered, because silence on this planet felt like it was watching me back. The room was smaller than I expected, which I appreciated. Less space meant fewer places for something terrifying to stand unnoticed. A narrow bed, a wall-mounted console that hummed softly, and a storage unit that looked like it had been designed by someone who had never actually used a storage unit. I dropped my toolkit on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, letting out a long breath. All right, I said to no one in particular. Simple assignment, fix systems, avoid eye contact with walking nightmares. Try not to die in a way that becomes a cautionary tale. The console flickered, as if in agreement or mild concern. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, which had a faint grid of embedded lights that adjusted based on atmospheric conditions. At least that's what the manual said. Right now they were dim, casting a soft glow that made everything look slightly unreal, like I had stepped into a simulation that hadn't finished rendering. I was just starting to relax when the door slid open without warning. I sat up so fast I nearly launched myself off the bed. She stood there. Of course she did. For a moment, neither of us moved. The doorway framed her in a way that made her seem even taller, her posture perfectly balanced, her long ears angled slightly forward now, as if she was focusing on something very specific. Possibly me. Definitely me. I think you might have the wrong room, I said, because clearly my survival instincts were built around stating the obvious. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her with a quiet hiss that felt far louder than it should have. I glanced at the door, then back at her. Or not. That's also a possibility. She didn't respond. She just stood there, her gaze fixed on me with that same unsettling intensity. Up close, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just that she was still, it was that she was never not still. Even when she moved, there was no excess, no wasted motion. Every shift, every breath, was controlled to a degree that made my own existence feel sloppy. I cleared my throat. So this is my room, I explained, gesturing vaguely around the space. I was just about to sit, maybe lie down. Very advanced human activities. Nothing. Are you here for maintenance? I added, immediately regretting it. Because I can assure you, everything is functioning at a level that is, statistically speaking, acceptable. Her head tilted slightly. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it felt significant, like a system recalibrating. Then, without a word, she walked past me and stopped near the far wall. She turned, positioning herself with a clear view of the entire room, including me. Oh, I said slowly, you're not here for maintenance. She remained silent. I stood up, mostly because sitting felt inappropriate under the circumstances, and also because I wasn't entirely sure she wouldn't decide that sitting made me an easier target. Let me just check something, I muttered, moving to the console. My fingers hovered over the interface, pulling up the assignment details, shared quarters. I stared at the words for a long moment, hoping they would rearrange themselves into something less concerning. They did not. Of course, I whispered. Of course we're sharing. I turned back to her, forcing a smile that felt more like a structural compromise than an expression. Well, this is efficient, very efficient, saves space, encourages teamwork. Her eyes followed me as I spoke, tracking every movement with precise attention. It was like being observed by a system that had been designed to detect threats, except I wasn't entirely sure it had decided I wasn't one. Just to clarify, I continued, because stopping now seemed like it would be a mistake. I have no intention of doing anything threatening. I barely have the intention of doing anything at all, to be honest. I'm more of a background presence. Still nothing. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. You don't talk much, do you? She took a step closer. I froze. It wasn't a dramatic movement. It was quiet, controlled, almost casual, but the distance between us shortened, and suddenly the room felt even smaller. Her gaze didn't waver, and I had the distinct impression that she was analyzing something, processing data in a way that had nothing to do with machines. Okay, I said carefully. Closer is fine. We can do closer. That's a distance people exist at. She stopped just a few steps away. For a brief moment, I thought she might say something. Her lips parted slightly, her posture shifting just enough to suggest an action. But then it passed, like a signal that had been interrupted before it could fully form. Instead, she turned and moved to the opposite side of the room. I blinked. Well, I said, exhaling slowly, that was a moment. She positioned herself near the wall again, standing in that same controlled stance, her presence steady, unyielding. It occurred to me then that she wasn't just standing there. She was waiting, watching, remaining in a state that looked less like rest and more like readiness stretched to its absolute limit. I glanced at the bed, then back at her. You know, I said, lowering myself cautiously onto the edge of it, humans have this thing called sleep. It's very popular where I'm from. Highly recommended. No reaction. 8 hour, I added. Sometimes less, sometimes more, depending on how many bad decisions you've made that day. She didn't move. I lay back slowly, keeping one eye on her, because I valued my continued existence. The ceiling lights adjusted slightly, dimming further as if encouraging the idea. This is happening, I murmured. I'm going to sleep in a room with the most feared warrior on the planet. That's a sentence I didn't expect to say. Silence. I closed my eyes, then opened them again almost immediately. She was still there, exactly as she had been, unmoving, alert, her gaze fixed somewhere just beyond me. And for the first time, I realized something that made the situation even stranger. She wasn't watching me because she wanted to. She was watching because she couldn't stop. I didn't fall asleep immediately. That would have required a level of trust I simply did not possess, especially not while sharing a room with someone who looked like she could dismantle a battle tank with mild curiosity. Instead, I lay there very still, eyes half closed, performing what I hoped was a convincing imitation of sleep. It turns out pretending to sleep is much harder when someone is actively observing you. At least I assumed she was still observing me. I resisted the urge to check. There are moments in life where ignorance feels like a protective mechanism, and this was definitely one of them. If she had decided I was no longer worth observing, I wasn't sure that would be an improvement. Just sleep, I whispered to myself. You've slept in worse places. Probably. That wasn't entirely true, but I was trying to stay positive. Minutes passed, or hours. Time had a way of becoming uncertain when your survival instincts were quietly arguing with your exhaustion. Eventually, my body decided it had reached its limit. My thoughts slowed, my breathing deepened, and despite every rational objection, I drifted into actual sleep. I don't know how long I was out when something changed. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. More like the absence of something. The room felt different, quieter in a way that wasn't normal. My eyes opened slowly, the dim light of the ceiling panels casting faint shadows across the walls. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then I remembered. I turned my head, expecting to see her exactly where she had been, standing, watching, unmoving. She wasn't there. I sat up immediately, my heart picking up speed in a way that felt very justified. Okay, I muttered, scanning the room. That's new. The space was empty. The door was still closed. The console hummed softly, oblivious to my growing concern. For a brief, very uncomfortable second, I considered the possibility that she had simply vanished. Then I heard it, a soft, uneven sound. I turned toward the far side of the room, my gaze dropping slightly. She was there, on the floor. I blinked, certain my brain was misinterpreting what it was seeing. She was curled slightly, one arm resting near her side, her posture loose in a way that felt completely wrong for someone like her. Her long ears were no longer angled in sharp awareness, but relaxed, one of them brushing lightly against the surface beneath her. She's, I started, then stopped. Sleeping. The word felt absurd, even forming in my mind. I shifted carefully, lowering my feet to the floor as quietly as possible. Every instinct I had told me not to get closer, not to interfere, not to do anything that might disrupt whatever impossible state she was in. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and I have never been particularly good at ignoring it. I took a step. No reaction. Another step. Still nothing. I crouched slightly, keeping a cautious distance, watching her with the same level of attention she had given me earlier. Up close, the difference was even more striking. The tension that had defined her every movement was gone. Her breathing was steady, slow, almost fragile. There was no sign of the relentless vigilance I had seen before. "You've got to be kidding me," I whispered. The most feared warrior on the planet, reduced to this. I glanced at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Alarms blaring, soldiers rushing in to contain whatever catastrophic failure had just occurred. But the corridor beyond remained silent. "You know," I continued quietly, because talking had become my default response to confusion, "if this is some kind of test, I would just like to state that I am not qualified." She shifted slightly. I froze. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it was enough to send a very clear message through my nervous system. I remained completely still, watching as her posture adjusted, her head tilting just a fraction. Her expression, which had always been so controlled, now seemed softer. "Right," I breathed. "Still sleeping? That's good. Sleeping is good." I sat back slowly, putting a bit more distance between us, because proximity suddenly felt like a variable I didn't fully understand. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Everything I had been told, everything I had observed, pointed to one conclusion: she did not sleep, and yet here she was. I leaned back against the wall, folding my arms as I studied her from across the room. "This is going to cause problems," I murmured. "A lot of problems." Because if she could sleep, then she wasn't just a weapon. She was something else. Something unpredictable. Something human. I exhaled slowly, letting my head rest against the wall. "You know," I added after a moment, "I always wanted to be part of something important. I just didn't think it would involve accidentally turning a living legend into a nap enthusiast." She didn't respond. Of course she didn't. But as I sat there watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Not just in her, in the space between us. And whatever it was, it had started the moment I walked into her world and apparently convinced it to slow down. I closed my eyes again, though this time it wasn't out of exhaustion, it was out of realization. Tomorrow was going to be complicated. I didn't realize when I fell asleep again. One moment I was sitting against the wall, watching the most dangerous being on the planet take a peaceful nap on the floor, like she had misplaced a battlefield somewhere. And the next moment my eyes opened to a very different problem. She was standing over me, not close enough to be immediately alarming, but close enough that my brain skipped several steps and went directly to panic before settling on confusion. "Good," I said automatically, my voice rough from sleep. "You're upright again. That's reassuring. For everyone involved." She didn't react. Of course she didn't. Her eyes were fixed on me with that same intensity, but something about it felt off. Not weaker, not softer, just different, like the sharp edge had been dulled by something she didn't fully understand. Her long ears were angled slightly forward, catching everything, analyzing everything, but without the same rigid tension from before. I pushed myself up slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "So," I continued, brushing imaginary dust off my sleeve, I'm going to go ahead and assume that what happened last night was not part of the official operational routine. Silence. I gestured toward the floor. Because I've seen a lot of strange things in my life, but you sleeping on the ground like you were avoiding rent is definitely near the top of the list. Nothing, I sighed. Right. Still not a conversationalist. She stepped back. It was a small movement, but it gave me space, which I appreciated more than I could reasonably express. I stood fully, stretching slightly, mostly to remind my body that it was still functional. You know, I said, glancing toward the console, if anyone asks, I'm going to say this is all part of a highly advanced relaxation protocol. Very cutting edge, not widely understood. Her gaze followed me as I moved, tracking every step, every shift in posture. But again, something had changed. The way she watched me now wasn't just assessment. There was a hesitation in it, a fraction of a pause between observation and reaction. I stopped near the console, pulling up the system logs more out of habit than expectation. Let's see if anything exploded overnight, I muttered. The interface flickered to life, lines of data scrolling across the screen. Energy levels stable, security systems normal. No alerts, no anomalies. No explosions, I said. That's always a good sign. We like days without explosions. Behind me, I heard a faint sound. Not a step, not a shift. Something smaller. I turned. She was closer. Again. I blinked. You know, I feel like we're developing a pattern here. She didn't stop this time. She moved until she was just within arm's reach, her presence filling the space between us in a way that made the room feel even smaller. Her eyes were locked onto mine, searching, calculating. Then she did something unexpected. She spoke. You. The word was quiet, almost uncertain, like it had been unused for a long time. I stared at her. Yes, I said after a moment. That's me. I've been you my entire life. It's a strong identity. Her brows shifted slightly, a subtle movement that suggested confusion. You, she repeated slower this time. I pointed to myself. Still me. She looked at her own hand for a brief second, then back at me, as if trying to connect something that didn't quite align. You changed, she said. I opened my mouth, then paused. I did. She nodded once. I considered that. Well, I did wake up, so technically that's a change. Very impressive, I know. Her expression didn't shift into anything resembling humor, but her gaze lingered on me longer than before, as if she was processing more than just my words. I lowered my hand slowly. What do you mean changed? She didn't answer immediately. Her long ears twitched slightly, adjusting to something I couldn't hear. Then carefully, like each word required effort, she said, Before noise. I frowned. Noise? She gestured vaguely, not toward the room but toward me. Now, quiet. I stared at her, the pieces of the situation beginning to rearrange themselves into something that made a little too much sense. You're saying, I said slowly, that I'm quieter than everything else? She nodded again. I let out a short breath, rubbing the back of my neck. That's new. No one has ever described me as quiet. Usually it's the opposite, excessively not quiet. She didn't respond to that, but her posture shifted slightly, just enough to suggest that standing so close wasn't as uncomfortable for her as it should have been. I glanced at the floor where she had slept, then back at her. And last night? That was because of this. Because I'm quiet? Another nod. I exhaled, long and slow. Okay, that's a lot. I took a step back, more for my own mental stability than anything else. So, let me get this straight. You've been in a constant state of, whatever this is, I gestured toward her, and somehow, being near me turns it off? She didn't like the word off. I could see it in the slight tightening of her posture. Not off, she said. Less. Less, I repeated. Right. Less is good. We like less. Less is safe. I paused, then added, usually. She watched me carefully, as if waiting for something. For what it's worth, I said, shrugging slightly. I didn't do anything. I just showed up. That's kind of my specialty. She stepped closer again. I stopped moving entirely. There was no immediate threat in her posture, no aggression, no indication that she intended harm, but the intensity of her focus was still there, just quieter, like everything else. "You stay," she said. I blinked. "I was planning to. It's my room." She shook her head slightly. "Stay near." I looked at her, then at the door, then back at her. "Right," I said softly. "That's going to be a problem." Because outside this room, the world expected her to be something very different. And if they found out she wasn't, neither of us was going to have an easy time explaining it. I rubbed my face, already feeling the weight of a situation I hadn't agreed to, but somehow fully owned. "You know," I muttered, "I really should have read the assignment details more carefully." She didn't understand the joke, but she didn't step away either. And for some reason, that felt more important than anything else. The next few hours felt like a quiet experiment neither of us officially agreed to participate in, yet neither of us seemed willing to interrupt. I moved around the room deliberately slow, pretending I had tasks that absolutely required my attention. The console, for example, had not changed since I checked it 5 minutes ago, but I studied it again with the seriousness of someone trying to decode the secrets of the universe. Behind me, she stayed close. Not uncomfortably close, not threatening, just near. Like proximity itself had become important in a way I didn't fully understand. "You know," I said, tapping the console lightly, "if anyone walks in right now, I'm going to have to explain this in a very professional tone. And I don't think I have the vocabulary for it." No response. I glanced over my shoulder. She was standing a few steps behind me, her posture relaxed in a way that still felt unnatural for her, like her body was testing a new setting it didn't fully trust yet. Her long ears shifted slightly as I spoke, catching every word. "Maybe I'll say this is a calibration process," I continued. "Yes, that sounds official, very technical, highly classified." She tilted her head again, that small, precise movement that seemed to replace entire conversations. "Calibration," she repeated quietly. I smiled. "Exactly. You're learning already. This is going great." She didn't smile back, but there was no tension in her stance either. That alone felt like progress. I turned back to the console, scrolling through data I barely needed to read. My thoughts, however, were not focused on the system diagnostics. They were circling around one unavoidable fact. This wasn't supposed to happen. Whatever had been done to her, whatever enhancement kept her locked in that constant state of alertness, it wasn't something that just paused, not without consequences. I frowned slightly, adjusting a few settings just to look occupied. "So," I said, keeping my tone light, "hypothetically speaking, if someone had a system that was always running at maximum capacity and suddenly that system slowed down, that might cause problems." Silence. I nodded to myself. "Yes, problems. That's the word we use when things go wrong in interesting ways." She stepped closer again. I didn't turn this time. I just felt it. The subtle shift in the air, the quiet presence at my back. "Not wrong," she said. I paused, my hand hovering over the console. "Not wrong? Different." I let out a small breath. "That's a very optimistic way of looking at it." I turned slowly, facing her. "Different is good sometimes. Other times, different is how people end up in reports with a lot of concerned signatures." Her gaze remained steady, but there was something else in it now. Not confusion, not calculation. Focus. "Before," she said, choosing each word carefully. "Always noise." I nodded. "You mentioned that." She touched her temple lightly, then lowered her hand. "Here. Always. Fast." I watched her, my expression shifting, despite my attempt to keep things light. "And now?" She looked at me. "Slow." I let that sit for a moment. "Slow," I repeated. "You make that sound like a good thing." She didn't answer immediately. Her long ears shifted again, reacting to something distant, something I couldn't perceive. For a brief second, I saw the tension return, just a flicker, like a system trying to reassert control. Then it faded. "Safe," she said. I blinked. "Safe?" I echoed, because that was not a word I expected from her. She nodded once. I leaned back slightly, folding my arms. Okay, I said slowly. That's new. I looked around the room as if the walls might offer some insight. You're telling me that being near me makes everything slow down, and that makes you feel safe. Another nod. I stared at her for a long moment, then let out a short, quiet laugh. That's ironic. Her head tilted again. I'm not exactly known for making situations safer, I explained. I once tried to fix a stabilizer and accidentally improved it so much it exploded. Long story. She didn't react to the joke, but she didn't look away either. I rubbed my face, exhaling slowly. This is going to be a problem, I muttered again, though the words felt heavier now, because this wasn't just a strange interaction anymore. This was dependency. I pushed myself off the console, taking a step to the side. Instantly, I felt it, the shift. Her posture changed, not dramatically, but enough to notice. The tension returned, subtle but real, like something tightening just beneath the surface. I froze. She took a step forward. The tension eased. I stared at her, then at the space I had just occupied. Right, I said quietly. Distance matters. I moved another step away. Again the change. Slight but undeniable. Her breathing sharpened just a fraction. Her ears angled back, catching more, processing more. The calm wasn't gone, but it was slipping. I stepped back toward her. It returned. I let out a slow breath, the pieces clicking into place in a way I didn't like. This isn't just proximity, I said under my breath. This is regulation. She didn't understand the word, but she watched me closely, as if trying to follow the thought itself. I shook my head slightly, a humorless smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. Congratulations, I murmured. You've turned me into a walking system patch. She stepped closer again, until there was barely any space between us. I didn't move. Stay, she said softly. I met her gaze, the weight of the situation settling in. Yeah, I replied, my voice quieter than before. That's the part I'm worried about. Because staying wasn't just a choice anymore. It was becoming a requirement. And requirements in places like this always came with consequences. By the time I stepped outside the room, I had already made a very careful decision. I was going to act normal. This, of course, was a terrible plan because I had no idea what normal looked like on a planet where people treated silence like a survival strategy and avoided eye contact with a single individual as if it were a known hazard. She walked beside me, not behind, not ahead, beside. That alone was enough to draw attention. The corridor felt different the moment we entered it. Conversation stopped, not abruptly but gradually, like someone lowering the volume on a room instead of switching it off. A group of soldiers near the far wall straightened, their eyes flicking toward her and then quickly away. No one acknowledged me, which was consistent with my preferred level of visibility, but the shift in atmosphere was impossible to ignore. Well, I muttered under my breath, this is subtle. She didn't respond, but I noticed her ears shift slightly, reacting to the sounds around us. The calm I had seen inside the room was still there, but thinner now, stretched across a space that was clearly not designed to support it. Stay close, she said quietly. I glanced at her. I'm literally right here. Closer. I hesitated, then took half a step toward her. Immediately I felt it again, not physically, not in any way I could measure, but in the way her posture adjusted, the way the tension eased just a fraction. It was becoming predictable, which was not comforting. Okay, I whispered. This is officially strange. We continued down the corridor, and I became very aware of how unnatural this looked. The most feared warrior on the planet, walking at a controlled, measured pace, and me, matching it like I had any business being part of this equation. A technician passed us, nearly dropping the device in his hands when he saw her. His eyes flicked to me for a brief second, confusion replacing fear, as if he was trying to solve a problem he didn't have enough data for. I gave him a small nod. Morning, I said. He didn't respond. Friendly place, I added. We reached the main operations chamber, and that's when things became more complicated. The room was large, filled with layered displays and shifting holographic projections. Data flowed in the steady streams, updating in real time as the planet's systems monitored everything from atmospheric fluctuations to orbital traffic. At the center stood a raised platform where several officers were gathered, their attention focused on a rotating tactical map. The moment we entered, all of that attention shifted. Not to me, to her, of course. "She's here," someone murmured. I resisted the urge to turn around and confirm that, yes, she was indeed still here. An officer stepped forward, his posture rigid, his expression carefully neutral. "You were not scheduled for this cycle," he said. She didn't answer. I cleared my throat because silence in a situation like this felt like it might escalate into something unpleasant. "We were just passing through," I offered. Very casually, no schedule disruption intended. The officer looked at me. That was new. "Who are you?" he asked. I smiled slightly. "That's a great question. I've been asking myself the same thing since I got here." He did not appreciate the humor. "She is required for active readiness," he said, his gaze shifting back to her. "Any deviation—" "She's here," I interrupted, gesturing vaguely between us. "And she's ready." In a slightly less terrifying way, but still very effective, I'm sure. That was when I felt it. The shift. Her posture tightened, not dramatically, but enough to notice. The calm that had been holding steady began to fracture, small pieces of tension returning, like cracks forming in something that wasn't meant to bend. I glanced at her. Her eyes were sharper now, more focused, more dangerous. "Right," I muttered. "That's not ideal." The officer noticed it too. His expression changed just slightly, as if something had aligned with his expectations. "Reactivation," he said quietly, almost to himself. "No," I said immediately, stepping closer to her without thinking. The effect was instant. The tension eased, not gone, but reduced. The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes was now on me. I froze. "Okay," I said slowly, raising my hands just a fraction. "I can explain this. Probably, with enough time and very patient listeners." No one moved. The officer studied me, his gaze sharp, calculating. "You," he said, his tone shifting, "you are affecting her state." I considered denying it. I really did. But at this point, that felt like lying about gravity while actively falling. "Define affecting," I replied carefully. He stepped closer, his attention no longer on her, but on me. "Her enhancements maintain continuous combat awareness. They do not fluctuate." I nodded. "Yes, I gathered that. Very impressive system, extremely committed. And yet," he continued, "they are fluctuating." I smiled, though it felt less natural now. "Well, systems evolve. Sometimes they improvise." He didn't react. Of course he didn't. "Step away," he said. I didn't move. Not because I was brave, because I had already seen what would happen. "I wouldn't recommend that," I said quietly. His expression hardened. That was not a suggestion. I glanced at her again. The moment stretched. "Okay," I murmured, mostly to myself. "Here's the part where I make a decision that will definitely not come back to haunt me." I took a step back. The change was immediate. Her posture snapped into something sharper, more precise. The calm shattered, replaced by the familiar, terrifying focus I had seen before. Her ears angled back, her breathing shifted, her entire presence becoming something far more dangerous. The room reacted instantly. Several soldiers moved, not aggressively, but ready. I stepped forward again. The tension eased. The soldiers froze. The officer stared at me. I let out a slow breath. "Yeah," I said softly. "That's the problem." Silence settled over the room, heavy and uncertain. For the first time since I arrived on this planet, I wasn't invisible anymore. And judging by the way they were all looking at me, that was about to become a very serious issue. The room did not return to normal after that. It couldn't. People tried, of course. Officers resumed their positions, data continued to flow across the displays, and someone even cleared their throat as if that might restart reality in a more comfortable direction. But the shift had already happened, and everyone knew it, including me. "Well," I said quietly, mostly to myself, "this is exactly how I imagined things would go. Smooth, controlled, absolutely not spiraling." No one laughed. She stood beside me, not tense, Not fully relaxed either. Something in between. Something new. Her presence no longer dominated the room through fear alone. Now it carried something else, something uncertain, and to them, far more dangerous. Choice. The officer in front of us studied the situation like it was a problem that refused to behave logically. "You will remain," he said to me, his voice measured. "For observation." I tilted my head slightly. Observation sounds a lot like being watched until someone decides I'm inconvenient. That is a possibility. Appreciate the honesty. He didn't react, but his attention shifted briefly to her, then back to me. Her function must be preserved. I nodded slowly. "You mean the part where she never stops being ready to fight?" "Yes." I glanced at her. Her eyes were not on him. They were on me. "She doesn't want that," I said. That caused a ripple through the room. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough to be felt. The officer's gaze sharpened. "She does not determine her function." I let out a small breath. "That's where I think you're wrong." Before he could respond, she moved. It wasn't fast. It wasn't aggressive, but it was deliberate. She stepped forward, placing herself slightly ahead of me, not blocking me, but not leaving me behind either. A position, a decision. The entire room went still. "You stay," she said, her voice quieter than before, but steadier. I blinked. I'm starting to feel like that's less of a suggestion and more of a life plan. She didn't look at me this time. Her attention remained on the officer. "I choose," she said. The word landed harder than anything else she had said. The officer's expression shifted, not into anger, but into something colder. "Your enhancements were designed to eliminate hesitation." She shook her head slightly. "No, more." A pause. I rubbed my face lightly. "Okay," I murmured. "This is the part where everything becomes very complicated." The officer took a step forward. "You are deviating from operational parameters." She didn't move. "I am not broken," she said, slower now, more certain. "I am different." I couldn't help it. I smiled a little. "Careful," I said under my breath. "They don't like different." The officer looked at me again. "You have altered a critical asset." I raised a hand slightly. "I prefer to think of it as improving functionality. That is not your role." "Neither is accidentally fixing things that no one else could," I replied. But here we are. There was tension again, but not the kind I had seen before. This wasn't fear. This was uncertainty. And uncertainty, in a system built on control, was far more dangerous. She stepped back slightly, just enough to stand beside me again. Not behind, not ahead, beside. "Stay," she said again, softer this time. I exhaled slowly, the weight of everything settling into something clearer. At the beginning, I had wanted to stay invisible, to fix things quietly, avoid attention, leave without becoming part of anything. That was no longer an option. I straightened a little, glancing at the officer. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "At least not in the way you're expecting." His gaze remained fixed on me, calculating outcomes I couldn't see. "This will be monitored," he said. "Of course it will," I replied. "Everything here is." But something had already slipped beyond their control. They just hadn't fully accepted it yet. Time passed differently after that, not in a dramatic way. No alarms, no sudden upheaval, just small changes that accumulated until they couldn't be ignored. She no longer stood in constant readiness, not completely. There were still moments, brief flashes where the old system reasserted itself, but they didn't last. Not when I was there. And I was always there. Not because I had to be, because I chose to be. "You talk too much," she said once, standing near the observation window as distant ships moved across the sky. I smiled slightly. "That's been mentioned before." She tilted her head, her long ears shifting with a soft, natural motion. "But it is quiet." I leaned against the wall, watching the same distant lights. "I'll take that as a compliment." She didn't correct me. That felt like progress. Outside, the planet continued as it always had, structured, controlled, precise. But inside, something had shifted. Not just in her, in me. I wasn't just fixing broken systems anymore. I was part of one that was changing. And for once, I didn't try to step away from it. I glanced at her, standing there. No longer just a weapon, no longer just a legend. Something else. Something more. Well, I said lightly, if this is my new assignment, I'm going to need better compensation. She looked at me. A pause, then, just barely, something like the beginning of a smile. I let out a quiet breath, looking back at the distant horizon. Yeah, I murmured. This might actually be worth it.